Hi, and welcome to this week's Sunday School. Now, I've got 3 pictures to show you this morning. Here we go. 3 babies. Now, likely that it's my 3 kids, isn't it? So I wonder if you can guess which one's which. Well, I don't think I'm going to give out any prizes for guessing that the one with his cap on the wrong way round is Ben. But can you guess which of these 2 is Sally and Becky? Actually, this one here is Becky, and the one at the other end is Sally. It's really hard to tell, isn't it? I'd love for you to show me your baby photos. Maybe you could bring one into Sunday School next time you come, or post it on the Junior Sunday School WhatsApp group. That would be really fun to see. Well, today's story is all about a baby that his parents have waited a long time for. Today's story is called A Promised Child. Well, Abraham was probably just having an ordinary day when suddenly something extraordinary happened. God visited him. And our story today is found in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, chapter 15, and it starts at verse 1. This is what God had to say to Abraham. "Don't be afraid, Abraham," he said. "I am your shield and your very great reward." Well, God is very powerful. It must have been amazing for God to come to Abraham and say, "I'm going to look after you and I'm going to reward you." What do you think Abraham said to God when he heard those amazing words? Chapter 15 tells us, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." If you remember, Abraham was a very rich man. But Abraham and Sarah had no children of their own. So when Abraham died, everything he had would go to his servant, Eliezer. But even so, would you speak to God like that? Do you think God would have been angry with Abraham for speaking to him like that? Well, Genesis chapter 15 verses 4 and 5 tell us what God said after Abraham's outburst. "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took Abraham outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." God was repeating a promise he'd made to Abraham before, that his family would be so big they couldn't be counted, just like you can't count the stars in the sky. But at this point, Abraham was an old man. Do you think he really believed what God was saying to him? Verse 6 says this, "Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness." So Abraham did believe God, and God was so pleased. You see, God never forgets his promises. God is always faithful. We now fast forward in the story 12 years, which is a long time, longer than any one of you has been alive, and a lot has happened to Abraham in that time. But still, Abraham and Sarah have no children of their own. How do you think they felt about that? I wonder. We pick up the story again in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 1. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance to his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I found favour in your eyes, my lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed and then go on your way now that you've come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 16 kilograms of finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. In those days, it was just normal and in fact good manners to offer something to eat and some water to wash and to drink to strangers who were passing by so that they could be rested before they continued on their journey. But these 3 men were far from ordinary visitors. It was in fact Jesus and 2 angels. But Abraham suspected nothing. These looked like ordinary men to him. We pick up the story again in verse 9. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" You see, in the tent, Sarah could hear what was being said, and she thought they were crazy. She was 90 years old. This was impossible. We pick up the story again in verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I didn't laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." Well, Jesus is God, and so not only did he know Sarah's thoughts, but he can give her a miracle child at whatever age she is. Whatever God has planned will happen, and nothing can get in the way of that. The Bible is full of stories about how God promises things for the future, and many people have the attitude, like Sarah, of thinking that's impossible, and they just laugh. Abraham trusted God, and God helped Abraham to believe, and we need to be more like Abraham and take God at his word, because what God says and what God promises always happen. So how does our story pan out? We need to turn to Genesis chapter 21 to find out. From verse 1. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, And the Lord did for Sarah what he'd promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I've borne him a son in his old age." Incredible. Abraham is 100 years old when his son is born. And he names his son Isaac, which means he laughs, as a reminder of the promise that God kept to Abraham and Sarah. So now they are laughing with joy, not disbelief. You see, God's timing is very different from ours, but it's always perfect. God is never late, even if his timing is a surprise to us. God has a plan for you and for me, but we don't necessarily know what that is. And so we have to trust that God will do as he promises in our lives, just as he did for Abraham. Well, in today's story, we've seen God keeping his promises, even when it involves a miracle to do so. And so we can be sure that God has always and always will keep his promises to us. Right from when we ask God to save us, if somebody asks God to save them, he always will. And then he promises, doesn't he, to be with us and to care for us, to forgive us when we ask for forgiveness, all sorts of things, right up to him promising that one day Jesus will return. I wonder if you can think of more. Maybe you could make a list of the promises that God makes to you. And that's a great thing to do because it reminds you what God will always do for you. Before we go, we're going to pray together. Lord, help us to trust your plan for our lives and not to worry about our future. Amen. Okay, so you can do your activity sheet now with all the puzzles that are there, and I'll see you next week in the next instalment of our stories all about Abraham.